Okay, good. Well, I just want to say thanks, Nick and Hannah, for inviting me. It's nice to be rejoining public life to the extent that we are, and for a major queer conference. So thanks very much. This is great. And I just wanted to start a bit by thinking about how lockdown has been hard on queer modes of life. Despite the kind of importance of the internet to queer culture these days, I do think being in public and being together in public and social life is crucial to the maintenance of queerness and queer ways of life. You know, we think about the importance of bars, cafes, bathhouses, movie theaters, city streets, protests, etc. The importance of all of these public institutions as spaces for meeting that have obviously been inaccessible. And I also wanted to say, like, this kind of emphasis on the public was so important to kind of the first wave of queer theory. If we think about work on urbanization by John D'Amelio, Gail Rubin, Alan Garibay, Sex in Public, Michael Warner, Lauren Berlant, right? Challenges to the incredible shrinking public sphere, kind of anti-neoliberal discourse by Lisa Dugan, Lauren Berlant, others. The kind of significance of privacy in enshrining LGBT case law, thinking of David Ng, and writing on Lawrence v. Texas, and just like hatred of the family. Think about Leo Barsani channeling Andre Gide, right? The kind of escape from privacy, the kind of prison house of the home has been so important to the field in its formation. And there has been a second wave, I would say, of work in queer studies that has challenged the hegemony of some of this work. I'm thinking about work on kinship, intimacy, affect, queer domesticity, the couple, if we think about the GLQ issue on the couple, the queer ordinary, and all queer rural as opposed to queer urban, right? Those I would see this as a kind of second wave of interest in things that depart from the kind of focus on public urban life in the first generation. I've been a part of that work. I find it very compelling, very interesting, and I continue to be influenced by the 1994 essay by Biddy Martin called, which has a pretty great title, called "Extraordinary Homosexuals and the Fear of Being Ordinary." She was making an argument from a feminist perspective about the rise of queer theory, and basically saying, you know, let's not forget the ordinary people that we also are, right? We're queers, but we are also the ordinary people. So, you know, I've been invested in that work and supporting a lot of that work that is being done by other people. I do think the past year and a half could be a case of careful what you wish for, right? Because queer domesticity, like every kind of domesticity, there's been a glut of it, there's been too much of it. And the problem is kind of threatening to the threat of losing that connection to public life, right? To all forms of publicity, which we have obviously all been dealing with. And it's clear that those institutions are totally crucial to the maintenance of queer life. But at the same time, the kind of return from lockdown, the kind of exit from lockdown is being touted everywhere as return to normal or the new normal, right? So queer has also been the enemy of the normal for the past 3 decades. And so that doesn't look like a particularly promising future either, right? Either queer domesticity or the new normal. And so I think, you know, we find ourselves in a bit of an impasse and a difficult, complex moment. And it is a good one in which to take stock, as I think you guys are asking us to do in this conference, right? To think about the history of queer thought and its relationship to possible queer futures. So, so I'm going to give it my best shot to do that. I have to say I'm better on the past than I am on the future. I've sort of dedicated myself to thinking about the queer past, but I'm going to try to think about its relationship to the future. I have had a critique, I would say, even of the kind of focus on the future in general, but in queer theory in particular, which I think, if you look at it, has had a kind of tendency to embrace what we might call a kind of modernism, a kind of focus on the new, a focus on the young, the avant-garde, the vanguard, let's say, right? And that there is a kind of tendency in that sort of moving on to the next thing to disregard the past or bury it or be embarrassed by it, which is something I've worked on a lot. So I do have a sort of caution about that kind of potential of forgetting the past. And I think in the case of queer studies, we can't ignore the way that the focus on the new and novelty is linked to professional imperatives toward creativity, innovation, and so on, right? That actually dwelling in what has already happened is not exactly what the profession or scholarly imperatives ask for. Nonetheless, okay, so I have focused on the past, in Feeling Backward and elsewhere, that kind of thinking about the history of saddled queers and bad feelings in the past. This most recent work that I've been doing in this book, Underdogs, that you mentioned, Hannah, which is coming out this fall from Chicago, is really about the history of queer thought. Okay, so I've worked on the history of queer emotion, and I'm really thinking about the history of queer criticism, queer theory, queer thought, and the kind of a kind of alternate genealogy for that, thinking about where it comes from, and by returning to the kind of origins of queer theory, and that work has led me to a real interest in post-war 50s and 60s, mostly US social science, and particularly studies of deviance. Okay, so kind of work on social outsiders of all stripes, alcoholics, hobos, the disabled, homosexuals, but a miscellaneous category of everyone who is kind of on the margins of society. And this can seem like a fairly surprising kind of point of origin, in the sense that this work was top down, written by experts who often did not identify as deviant themselves. It's often widely seen as stigmatizing, even dehumanizing. And yet I'm really interested in the points of connection, which I think are quite real. So just to name a few of those to give you a sense of how this argument works, I'm thinking about the importance of the kind of what I was saying, the kind of miscellaneous nature of the outsider in deviant studies, right? Deviant studies wasn't studying one particular kind of social outsider, but social outsiders in general. Okay, and this to me is very much like the kind of emphasis on marginality in queer studies, right? It's not about promoting the interests of LGBT people. It's sort of identitarian in that sense. And deviant studies also took that approach, right? It was everyone on the margin who were united by their kind of the fact that they were stigmatized and their responses to being stigmatized, okay? So that is a crucial element, and I think we are sort of functioning with an idea of difference or deviance or outsiderhood or marginality that is basically inherited from this field, the social scientific field of deviant studies. But they also had a sense of power as relational and dynamic. Irving Goffman, whose book, 1963 book, Stigma on the Management of Spoiled Identity, which is one of my key texts in there, he says that a language of relationships, not traits, is needed to describe stigmatization, right? It's about the relationship between people, not particular traits, okay? And I think we very much have taken up on that idea. Just the focus on stigma itself, I think, is crucial in terms of how to think about the connection among different groups. Okay, this focus on stigma, which we today would think of as coalitional politics. They didn't use those words and they weren't explicitly political, but nonetheless, I think that the imprint of that kind of thought is very strong, strong in the field, okay, strong in the those are the kind of continuities, okay? So those are continuities. The differences are quite striking, okay? I think that's absolutely true. In particular, this difference that, as I said, it was experts looking at groups who were deviant and describing them, okay, and sort of, analyzing their folkways, let's say, a kind of ethnographic take on, an empirical take on sexual deviance, social deviance, as opposed to the activist field of queer theory, which did not describe deviance, but actually embraced deviance and said, we are queer, we're here, let's be deviant, right? So it's a call to action, and deviance as a activist imperative and as a form of resistance to the social, right? So that kind of move into activism from a kind of descriptive social scientific mode is kind of the key difference. And it's consistent with what was happening historically at that time. If we think about the kind of move from thinking about sort of marginal populations in the US, for instance, to the new social movements, right, where groups that had been described as deviant suddenly took control of their own movements, in the civil rights movement, movement for gay rights, feminist rights, and said, no, we're not deviant, like society is messed up and we're going to change it, right? So, queer theory and LGBT studies track along that mode. But what I'm trying to trace in the book is that this change from describing deviance to fomenting deviance, to making it happen, is not only a political difference, a social difference, a historical difference, but it is also an intellectual difference. And it has to do with the move from a social scientific framework to a framework in the humanities. And as we know, queer theory, as it began around 1990, was the province of psychoanalysts, literary critics, philosophers, art historians, classicists, people in the humanities, right? People in the humanities often thought that the social sciences were flawed because they were descriptive. They simply described the world as it was rather than projecting a possible new future, okay? So I'm basically trying to go back to this kind of genealogy, thinking about deviant studies into the activist field of queer studies, and think about the change not only as political, but also as disciplinary, as an intellectual genealogy, an intellectual history that's conditioned by disciplinary differences, okay? And so that is basically the framework of the book. And I think what's interesting is that revolution, that kind of transformation of the social sciences into the humanities from a descriptive to, let's say, a prescriptive idea of deviance was never really complete, okay? And for one example, I just want to look at a moment that has been really important to me in Gail Rubin's essay from 1984, Thinking Sex, okay? This is Notes Toward a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality, Rubin's essay, which itself is foundational for queer studies, okay? This is a crucial, for me, I would say maybe the crucial essay in terms of fomenting a kind of queer approach to sexuality and sexual difference. There is an interesting moment in there, which I have really taken a lot from in this book, which is about the moment when Rubin she's critiquing feminism in the context of the feminist sex wars, right? She's critiquing feminism for its kind of negative take on, butch femme, S&M, all of those aspects of the sex wars. And she says that she compares feminism to sexology, the kind of discredited pseudoscience of sexuality and gender difference. And she compares sexology to feminism and says that sexology is actually a better basis to ground a radical theory of the politics of sexuality than feminism, okay? Now this is, pretty crazy from the present, right, to think about that, because, we think of feminism as a crucial element to a radical politics of sexuality, not sexology, right? Sexology is stigmatizing, it's taxonomizing, it's dehumanizing. You know, we don't have a very good idea of sexology. But that's what Rubin says, and I want to read you just a moment from that essay, where she lauds sexology and empirical sex research in general for what she calls, quote, their abundant detail, welcome posture of calm, and well-developed ability to treat sexual variety as something that exists rather than as something to be exterminated. Okay, so she's talking about the kind of empirical basis of this field, which, you know, did just describe all of the different perversions, let's say. And for Rubin, that allowed them to kind of have a shelter in existence, to come into discourse and to be recognized as social facts, as opposed to feminism, a much more activist field, right, which said, like, these perversions, these forms of sexuality are bad, let's get rid of them, let's exterminate them, in Rubin's, you know, pretty strong language there, so we can bring in a different form of sexuality that is, say, anti-patriarchal, reciprocal, just, right? And, you know, I think in queer theory, we've come down on the side of the activist form of politics, right? Which is, let's make a better sexuality. Let's make a utopian form of sexuality. And Rubin identifies actually, and she's very influenced by deviant studies in this, she identifies with a very different strategy, which is about, let's provide shelter for what already exists. Okay, and she's thinking of marginal sexualities in particular. And it's a very different thing, but it's, you know, she's trained in social sciences. She's extremely influenced by deviant studies, and that is her take on that question. Okay, so that is basically the kind of argument that I'm pursuing in the book, is to say that this before queer studies, even before LGBT studies, there is a descriptive social scientific account of marginal genders and sexualities, which we've seen as simply apolitical or stigmatizing, or, you know, actively dehumanizing. But actually there is a different form of politics at work in this kind of representation of deviant groups that is descriptive and about giving them a foothold in the social, okay? And is not about making something better and sweeping away the old, but is actually about recognizing and giving place to what exists. Okay, so that's the book, and that's my account of this certain genealogy of the queer past and of the field. But how would that inflect the future? And I just want to kind of head toward a close by talking about that. And I guess, you know, one thing I would say is that maybe even if you admit this is a kind of interesting politics in relation to the past, okay, maybe if you grant me that with very little evidence at this point, you might say, but why would that help us in the future, or in the present even, right? Because rather than this moment, say in the 50s, when homosexuality is persecuted, it's illegal, it's you know, very rarely represented in, you know, mainstream discourse, it's politically suspect, then giving recognition that it exists is a powerful tool in that moment. But in the era of gay marriage and, you know, sort of like many media representations and you know, increasing global LGBT rights, is actually recognition of existence or giving shelter in discourse even a positive goal, right? Don't we need something more prescriptive rather than descriptive, right? Don't we need a kind of anti-normative, anti-capitalist, anti-nationalist, deeply critical account of sexuality that would allow for us to make a more radical and more transformative form of queer studies? And, you know, that is the kind of question, I think, the central question begged by this look to the past. What is the use of this kind of politics that's based, I would say, not on queer disruption, but on queer stabilization, right? It's actually a politics of stabilization, right? Giving shelter to what is marginal and threatened rather than disrupting what is out there. Okay, so what purpose could that possibly serve in this moment? Even if we accept that there are, of course, vulnerable queer and trans people out there, still, if we are thinking about mainstreaming queerness, then why go with this politics of stabilization? Okay. I just wanted to kind of put this again in a bit of historical perspective, but just to say that, like, I think some salient facts here would be the fact that that this anxiety or critique of mainstreaming as sort of a danger that besets LGBT life is fundamental to queer studies and queer politics, right? It's been there since the very beginning, right? In the late 80s and 90s, it was about the kind of the feeling that the kind of tactics for fighting HIV/AIDS were not going deep enough, they were not radical enough, right? But also issues like, the burgeoning very early on gay marriage movement, really gays in the military, other kinds of inclusion that were deeply troubling. And I would say it's not only been a kind of anxiety since the beginning, it's at the origin of queer studies, right? Queer studies and queer politics emerges to address the problem of mainstreaming, right? So this is a very old problem, right? We actually can't think about the word queer apart from the kind of critique or stance against mainstreaming. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing that I would keep in mind is that queer, in particular, as opposed to LGBT studies, LGBT politics, LGBT life, queer can't really be separated from academic or university life. Okay, so in that way, I look with a bit of skepticism on the narrative of queer institutionalization or mainstreaming. It's obviously found much more of a hold in the academy since then. But it's always been completely bound up with gender theory, critical theory, as it was actually fomented around 1990, right? So it has that kind of academic aspect to it, baked in from the beginning. And, that academic element has influenced, I think, public protest and public life ever since the origins of queer thought. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I'm just saying that is a fact, that the kind of material life of the university, of institutions, and the kind of ideas that are associated with a kind of post-structuralist humanities that was dominant around that time are crucial, right? That's very much central to the kind of idea of queer, right? And so I guess reflecting on this history and thinking about these kind of frameworks for thinking about the field, I think that that actually this kind of attention to questions about disruption, as I put in my title, but about also what might need shelter and might need to resist being swept away, and might need stabilization, is crucial. And I really can't help thinking about queer and its relationship to institutional life, since I actually teach queer studies as a tenured professor in an Ivy League institution, right? So it's always on my mind, let's say, right? It's my job, as well as being other things to me, but it is my job. But I think we're thinking about this this question at a moment of a real attack on institutions, universities, libraries, and so on. And so, I think there is a real question out there about which institutions might be in need of our support. And really, I think it's important to kind of reckon with the institutional history of queer, to think about how much the university and kind of para-institutional institutions around the university, presses, conferences like this one, and so on, have contributed to the vibrancy of queer life, right? And so I think, a kind of stark stance against institutions or against the state in the era of the decline of public institutions is highly problematic. So I applaud you guys. I heard in your introduction that you've kind of, maybe not very happily, but maybe so, you've moved sort of outside of the kind of the university space and are doing a lot more kind of community partnerships and other experimental kind of work. And I think that's great. And I think that's really, really important. But I also think we need a kind of reckoning with our own entanglement with the institution. And, I think that's particularly important as we think about, sort of the politics of disruption, and maybe thinking a bit more critically about the politics of disruption. And, I guess my call here is for something like, not to criticize anti-normativity or, and so on, because I do think, there is really a space for anti-normativity in terms of the critique of what exists. But I also think there is a need to articulate sort of queer norms and values, and to think about what we do want to hold on to, and to articulate queer norms and values kind of apart from queer againstness, right? The queer anti-everything, right? I think there are things that we do need to support, and I think that this kind of analysis may help us to rethink the kind of lines between queer radicals and the mainstream. I think those lines are actually more complicated than we tend to think, and that we want to be sure that when we're against stuff, we're not against things that we actually care about and want to cultivate, right? So I think that is kind of my sort of challenge or caution or call to think about queer disruption in that framework, right? What are the things that what do we want to treat as something that exists rather than something to be exterminated? That's really my question, right? And in the kind of anti aspect of queer thought and queer politics, is there something that we want to hold on to? And I would just add briefly that I think, rising to that challenge to think about the kind of complexity of disruption and stabilization, or radical and mainstream, is a reckoning with not only our institutional entanglements, but also a reckoning once again with Foucault's calls to in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, to rethink the repressive hypothesis, right? And this is a thing that people always say, like, the repressive hypothesis, Foucault's critique of the repressive hypothesis is so crucial, and yet we know that, and yet it's almost impossible to take it on, right? Because we just keep wanting to cut off the head of the king, right? We just keep wanting to say, like, fuck the man, we are the queer radicals, so I think that there is really a way in which Foucault challenges us to think about the way that, being against power is not being outside of power, right? And that these lines really bear further investigation. So that's my talk, and I'm happy to hear your guys' responses, take questions, whatever.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. In terms of how this next bit's going to go, I'm going to formulate a response around about something, and then I'm going to pass over to Nick, because I have a few things, probably not as Nick's very theoretical, whereas I work on like,
oh, no pressure,
like institutions.
Thanks for that.
Sorry about that.
But I'm gonna give a few thoughts. So I wanted to start with this idea of like queer can't be separated from kind of academic or university life. Actually, that we said it yesterday, but actually that was why we started Queer Disrupt. I particularly myself, I came from doing an undergraduate and a master's in history that was quite traditional, like very, very traditional. You know, like I didn't even hear the word decolonization until I came to do sociology. So then I started my PhD in sociology. You know, Kath is in the participants, but Kath Lambert is both myself and Nick's supervisor. Kath handed me all these books on queer theory and was like, "Here you go." And it took me months. I had no idea what was going on. I was like, "What is all of this knowledge? I have absolutely no clue where I'm starting." And it's so dense, and it requires some of it requires such a depth of knowledge that if it's your first time and you don't need to do it, you might just give up. But you know, they're actually talking, you know, in queer theory about people's everyday lives, you know, about these people on the margins, but these people on the margins can't access this knowledge. So one of the reasons that we started Queer Disrupt is to try and tackle this, to try and provide accessible knowledge. I don't think we hit the mark all the time. This is something we're working on, because we are invested. You know, we're so invested in this queerness that we sometimes get lost in it. So, you know, an example I can give: the first time we did the Queering the Quarantine, which is an archival project, but the first time we did the call for that, we thought it was really clear, and then we got nobody was responding, and then we got somebody to read it over, like somebody from the press office, and they were like, nobody would understand this, like you've written it so yeah, you've written it so abstractly, because I had a load of stuff in there about why we need to archive queerness, and nobody's going to understand that because they're not invested in the same way that we are. So I think there's something really interesting there, and I also think there's something really interesting here about this queer stabilization in this actually using the institution to your advantage, not completely being like, oh, I almost saw it, but like kind of fuck the institution, right? Like get rid of it, tear it down, because actually that's not the current world we live in. We live within these institutions. We rely upon these institutions to give us space to do this work. So you have to embrace it in some form or another. You know, I mentioned it a little bit yesterday because we had this conversation in the Queer Institutions panel, and there was some really beautiful, brilliant work in that panel. But Joseph Pearce works on decolonization and queerness, and I often look to this person's work to think about this stealing from the institution, using the institution where you can, to really to be able to make what difference you can within the space that you're given. I've got just two minor little other bits and pieces I wanted to say. So the other thing that really struck me was your conversation about history at the beginning. This idea, I've got so many notes and they're all over the place, I've written like sideways. But this idea of, you know, I started my own project, my project on queer representation in the museum, because actually a lot of people have the privilege of taking taking representation for granted, right? And when you take representation for granted, it's easy to dismiss it. It's easy to, you know, it's a privilege to be able to dismiss history and say that doesn't matter to me anymore. I don't have to think about that. But actually, some people don't get to dismiss this history. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement has really shown that last summer. You know, really, especially all these conversations about statues and all this kind of stuff. You know, some people don't have the privilege to be able to dismiss this history. So I think it is really important to continue to take stock and look back and go, actually, I think your upcoming work of thinking about the history of queer thought is really important, because it's often treated as this like abstract thing, but actually if you start to bring it back down and go, actually it was happening at this time for this reason, yeah, maybe we can have some really interesting conversations. Let me see if I need to say this, but no, I think I've already said everything I want. Yeah, thank you very much. That was really, really amazing.
Thank you for those comments. Those are really great. Nick, do you want to talk, and then maybe I can respond a bit after? Or
Yeah, I'll pass to Nick.
Second.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely introduction, Hannah. No pressure whatsoever there from my side of things. Great. History, I'm being flippant, but the truth is I am the more theoretical out of the two of us. I don't have a historical background. My background is in critical theory and gender theory, and so it's sort of the abstract. So I think my comments are going to be a bit shorter, but probably also a bit less ironically accessible. I think in terms of what I know, in terms of what I'm looking at. And I was really interested, you talked about earlier that piece, the extraordinary homosexuals and the fear of being ordinary. And this kind of fear, basically that entire title was, it made me kind of think about how this kind of narrative is perpetuated and re-perpetuated throughout time. And the most recent example, just because it's the one that just came into my head, was, believe it or not, RuPaul shouting at Tia Coffey in UK Drag Race and going, how fucking dare you be ordinary? There were all the ordinary people out there and basically saying you should be fabulous. And I remember thinking, you asshole, how dare you like that? But like, I think it kind of highlights almost word for word, actually, the name of the title in this kind of cycle that takes place. So that got me thinking about this kind of linguistic claim of ordinary. Is ordinary better or not? And I think you actually touched on that as we went through, so I won't delve into that a lot. The bit that I really wanted to kind of latch onto was this idea of shelter. And this idea of the entanglements that we're tied into, right? We are interplated into all of these different systems and structures that we struggle to try and untangle, as it were. And we're talking about the shelter, but in doing so, in sheltering that which is marginalized, because we are interpolated into so many complex webs and systems, we actually shelter that which can cause us the most damage as well. This made me think of, because I always draw on the pop culture references in my head, it's quite a well-known, but I mean, Bill Hicks sketch, when he talks about gays in the military. And I'm paraphrasing, but I'm quoting as much as I can. And he says something along the lines of like, who gives a fuck if there's gays in the military? They're still going out there and shooting poor brown people. Like, what the fuck has them being gay about? And it kind of made me think, like, if we're sheltering the gays in the military, we're actually still protecting the military in what was clearly a very kind of. And so my question to wrap up, is I think it's actually the challenge that you were raising, to be frank with you. So I'm not going to go into a lot of this, but is it kind of possible to kind of blast into this kind of newness, into this future, if we're looking at the past that we've got, that we're always going to be drawing on and interpolating? Can we is such a thing as a queer vanguard possible, right? If everything we're doing, we're interpolated and drawn on from the past, because we have to take the shit with the gold then, right? And the shit that comes with us stinks, you know, a lot of the time, and that's what we've got to do. So I guess it was just that kind of question about how we protect and how we kind of, can we have a fluid shelter where we can take what we want? Can we have our cake and eat it as queer people? I guess is the question. And
it's a cake made of shit or gold.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I'll kind of leave it there. There were just kind of ramblings and thoughts in my head, but
no, those are all great. I don't want to take too much time because I want to leave some time for questions, but I'll just say, you know, I think, you know, Hannah, your concerns about, both of you really, your concerns about accessibility are very real. And, you know, I personally think that this, you know, highly theoretical material that has been produced by queer thought, you know, by queer theorists in the last 30 years is basically, you know, directly useful, like for people's survival. Like I believe that. And so my job as a teacher, I often feel is kind of, you know, one of translation basically, right? Because, you know, in order to access these texts, it's like you often have to have read, like, you know, or have some functioning notion of like, Lacan, Hegel, you name it, right? And, most people don't, like, most undergrads at Penn don't, right? And that's a highly privileged group of people. And so, it's basically about taking this material and trying to translate it, because on the one hand, it was this highly theoretical material that was produced in like elite academic settings. And at the same time, it did have another origin, another aim, which is like to transform the world and save people's lives, right? And so, I think that's part of the kind of paradox of working in this field, is it has both elements to it, right? And the question is sort of like how to translate that. But I do think it's important, as we try to work our way through this material and use this material and activate it, which has to be done, that we acknowledge its entanglement with these material and institutional and ideological forms. I mean, there's no point in denying that, right? Or denying the kind of sort of class location of many of the people who produce this queer radical work. I mean, it's, there's some paradoxes out there that I think, it'd be better if we could address. And I do think class is often the piece of this that drops out. So, I don't think deviant studies had an idea of sheltering marginal people. They didn't mean US soldiers, let's say, right? That's not the marginal population they're talking about, right? They're talking about, in today's terms, I would think like, the incarcerated, the undocumented, queer, trans women of color, right? People who are, actually marginal, right? Who are actually threatened. At the same time, when you think about the constitution of the US military, it's, if we think about them either as killers or as not killers, we're missing the whole class politics of who actually gets into the military, the class and race politics, which are profound, right? So, I mean, again, it's sort of a moment where you say like, fuck the military. And I totally agree, I'm a pacifist. But at the same time, like when you think about who is actually serving as soldiers, they're often, from the perspective of like, white college students, well, that seems pretty fucked up. But, if you actually recognize the kind of life situations that people are facing, and their kind of life options that are available to them, then it gives you a different perspective on people in the military, right? And that was part of the, I never supported gays in the military, but that was part of the logic, right? Which is that there are people who have run out of economic options, right? Who would like to have access to those, pensions and jobs and everything like that, and can't because they're gay or whatever, right? So it was a kind of civil rights issue in that sense. So just to say, like, I think those lines are complicated, let's see. I think there was something else that Hannah said that I wanted to respond to. Oh, it's really just more on the class thing, that in terms of like, a lot of conflicts that occur in like public spaces now, let's say around integrating like let's say about women-born, women-only spaces, right? And kind of trans politics. It's often actually, there is a conflict around gender politics, that's clear, right? There's a conflict around gender essentialism that is clear, and TERFs and whatever else. But there is often also a class and educational politics, the way those conflicts happen, right? Which is to say, it's often people who are fresh from gender theory classrooms who are making arguments about trans recognition against people who, have found solace in, say women-only spaces, feminist spaces, Black feminist spaces, and so on for quite a long time, right? So I often think that the sort of class dimension of these conflicts is often missing, and I was trying to kind of hit that in my response to your good point about the military as well. And I want to leave time for Q&A, but I'll just say, like, I think, Nick, your question about like how much do we have to let go of the past in order to move into the future? I mean, I just want to underline that I think that it's the right question. It's a question that has plagued like every social revolution ever, right? Like, You know, and there is like the kind of idea that, you know, you're kind of weighed down by the baggage of the past, right? That you're living the nightmare of history and you can't help repeating it. And it's better to just move on. But there's also the idea that by moving on and forgetting the past, you just are doomed to repeat it. So, I mean, it's a big question that I can really answer. I'll just say that, you know, I think that queer theory has, and queer politics has tipped a bit much, for my taste, in the direction of a kind of future orientation. And that I think, you know, that in my work, you know, on queer history, I just have found like a lot of resources that I think are, you know, quite directly helpful for thinking about future directions. So, so I'll leave it there so that we have some time for audience participation.
Thank you. And thank you for being so articulate and kind of reframing my slightly messy question in a way which was kind of understandable. It's, as you said, you are a teacher. You are translating. You're finding the gold in the shit. But I won't tell them that. What I will do is I do want to swing on to some questions as well, as you said. One question at the top has been quite big. I think you can see the questions as well if you want to read along, as it were, but I will read it out for the purposes of both the recording and the kind of there. But they're looking forward to your new book, but they've been thinking a lot about, the person asking the question, they've been thinking about the link between social science and queer theory. And they have two kind of questions / thoughts built on that, which is the idea of marginality is also discussed by bell hooks. And they're wondering if there's a link between Black thought, social thought, and queer thought can be made. And attached to that, do you have any thoughts about this kind of stigma or cancel culture or cancelling culture that's kind of gathering momentum, as it were, at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think, you know, when I talk about the kind of social science genealogy for queer thought, I mean, it's meant to be a supplement to other, you know, great work that I think people have done to try to draw out the resources and let's say the sources of queer thought. And, you know, certainly AIDS activism is one we know about. I think, you know, there's been more and more attention to the sex wars as a kind of source for queer thought, and Black feminism, right? Those have been kind of the crucial, and I think also trans activism as a kind of another source. So, you know, I don't mean to say let's replace these other genealogies with one. You know, it's basically, you know, these kind of like middle class, like white guys from the 50s. It's not really a great program for the future, let's say. So, you know, this is a supplement rather than a displacement of those other genealogies. That said, you know, I think bell hooks and other Black feminists who have, you know, worked on marginality, I think, you know, the imprint of what I would call deviant studies or kind of social problem thought is crucial. And I would just say, like, if you look at in the US, like Black feminism and its engagement with the Moynihan report, you know, and that the importance of the Moynihan report as kind of pathologizing Black kinship and Black motherhood is crucial, right? And Moynihan as a social, you know, it's coming right out of this kind of discourse of deviant studies, right? And so, you know, I think whether you're responding to it or working with it, you know, I think the imprint of this material can really use a wider scope that kind of gets the broader kind of history. I'm not saying that, you know, bell hooks is like a deviant scholar, but I do think that, you know, we find the imprint of this kind of deviance thinking in all kinds of work, even work that specifically opposes the kind of deviance framework. And that's part of what I do in the book, is to go through a lot of work in the field and sort of talk about how a kind of deviance, a kind of, in a sense, a kind of map of social deviance is inherited from this earlier field. And I think that's also true in thinking about the kind of wrestling with the pathologization of Black kinship in Black feminism. And maybe I'll pass on cancel culture just because it's a tough one.
It's okay. Just again, I'm just going to try and get in as many questions as we can, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So so much of queer theory is about not finding conclusive meaning or definition, whereas so much of like academia is based on the idea of kind of having a kind of set answer from that. So the question is, do you think that queer studies as a form kind of change from within in terms of creating paradigm shifts within kind of academic institutions?
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, I think one thing that this question kind of raises is that it could sound like, you know, I'm kind of not appreciating or acknowledging all of the things that are really different about queer thought in the academy, right? That, you know, because it was basically, you know, it really did import this kind of very different personnel, very different writing style, very different kind of model of, you know, I mean, if you look back at Michael Warner's Fear of a Queer Planet and, you know, his kind of account of what queer theory was going to do to the academy, you know, he said it's going to mess up all of the ways that people have of interacting, dressing, talking. And, you know, I mean, I certainly benefited from that, right? Like I probably wouldn't have, you know, I mean, I'm an English professor, but I probably wouldn't have just become like a, you know, a kind of, I don't know, modernist poetry scholar. Like the fact that there was this kind of space for, you know, queer life in the academy and queer ways of being and interacting, like has made it like livable for me in a way that, you know, I think is really powerful. It's given a lot of space to a lot of different kinds of thought and feeling. So, you know, I'm for queer theory. You know, I'm not against it, but I do think that that, you know, in terms of like this kind of idea of queer theory as a kind of rebel agent in the university, it's not quite accurate. And this is partly because, I mean, I think it's a bit different in the US than in the UK or Europe, where, you know, it really was born in the humanities, like queer as opposed to history of sexuality or LGBT thought. And it was born at a moment of kind of post-structuralist theory where not having answers to things was, you know, actually the highest form of academic life, right? It's actually not so resistant to kind of thought in the humanities, to literary thought, to philosophy, continental philosophy as it was fomented in the US Academy. It actually is quite consistent with those things, right? And I think it's for this reason that, you know, the kind of what we know to be the problem about queer theory, that, you know, it can tend to become so universal and so abstract that you forget that it's even about sexual communities or sexual practices in general, right? Because, you know, when you're queering the pitch or you're queering whatever, when you're queering stuff, you're basically just practicing a kind of post-structuralist kind of theory under the guise of queer thought. And I think those lines are actually quite confusing. So yes, in the context of a conservative academy that, you know, won't deal with identity and, you know, everything has to be like positivist knowledge. No, queer theory is a complete rebel, but that's not really how it happened in the US. It was actually quite consistent with many strands of academic culture, academic thought.
I think I think there are definite similarities over, at least in the UK, that I can speak of. I think we've probably got time for one more quick question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really interesting one. I guess it's kind of drawing on the idea of this kind of politics of stabilization. But like, how do we avoid this kind of naturalization of the binary relation between mainstream / marginal, which are not always stable and subject to historical, social, geopolitical, and many other, I guess, changes?
Yeah, I mean, strategy, I'm not sure. I just would say, like, I affirm that perspective, right? I think that, you know, the kind of, you know, mainstream versus radical binary is fairly tired. It doesn't actually, like, describe a lot of what's happening. You know, I think that, for instance, like the concept of homonormativity, which I've been critical of in print, but, you know, my feeling is like homonormativity is a very valuable term, right? It actually helps to describe this phenomenon of assimilation, which, you know, we know to be true, right? And it does drain the kind of radical potential of queerness as something outside or different to heterosexual norms. At the same time, you know, I think homonormativity is painting with way too broad a brush, right? I think it's something that, you know, clearly bears the imprint of having come from a kind of metropolitan, professional class kind of queer theory where, you know, what you might see around you and what you might actually live is something more like homonormativity. You might be like, you know, a queer homeowner sending your kids to private school and, you know, whatever, but that is not the reality of, you know, queer or trans life, like in, you know, the rest of the world, but even like, you know, just down the block or whatever, right? So, you know, I really think that, and partly what the book has tried to do is to go back to this social science work in the post-war period, which was characterized, as Foucault's work was, by an attention to the very small. It's actually called, you know, microanalysis or microsociology. And I think that sort of more detailed, more nuanced account of who's actually stigmatized, who's actually suffering, and a more objective look at, you know, a more sociological look at the kind of, you know, class, race, and gender politics of queer and trans social life right now, I think is one way to kind of push back against these sweeping characterizations that, you know, as we know, people are, you know, both radical and normative. Like that is the reality. We all live that mixed reality. So we need a more nuanced vocabulary, I think, to begin to unpick some of those big categories.
Cool. Thank you very much for being here, for talking, for answering those questions. We're gonna let you go.
Okay.
So you don't have to go over
Do the next
time.
thing. Yeah.